Interview volunteers to learn what skills they do or do not have and assign the work to them accordingly. Do you inspect the locations where your volunteers are working for potential hazards? Do you train volunteers to ensure that they can perform their task skillfully and safely? Are supervisors assigned to volunteers, and are they held accountable for making sure that volunteers perform their assignments as they've been trained? And the last question is, do you have a specific action plan in the event a volunteer is injured, injures someone, or damages someone's property? All right, next slide, please. And let's go on to the next slide. Thanks. All right, these are the 4 categories of claims that we see in our program. As we go through the session, I want you to think about what your volunteers do in your Medical Reserve Corps organization. Write down all the scenarios you can think of where a volunteer could be injured, injure someone else, damage someone's property, or commit a dishonest act that hurts the organization. In a phrase, what could possibly go wrong? Now, I'm sure that most of you are positive people most of the time, but sometimes you have to think negatively to keep negative things from happening. So we'll do some negative thinking today. Now, I'll get it going by giving you some examples of actual claims we have seen in the program. And we'll start with injuries to the volunteer. Falling is the most common type of accident that causes injury claims. To prevent falls, you have to look at the environment the volunteer will be assigned, whether it's a location you see every day or another location where the volunteer is assigned. If it's possible for the supervisor to scout those locations first, that's best. But if it isn't possible, tell your volunteers that you want them to be your eyes and your ears at the locations where they are assigned and report any conditions that might cause an injury to them or anyone else. And then designate a person to whom the volunteer can report, someone who can make sure that those hazards are eliminated, either doing that work themselves or assigning it to another capable volunteer. This is all groundwork for building a culture, you might say, in your organization of safety consciousness. All right, so what kind of hazards are we looking for that might cause a fall? Is there clutter on the floor? Boxes left where people are walking? Extension cords, poor lighting. We've had insurance claims caused by those kinds of falls. And as you think about the task your volunteers do they ever have to reach anything up high, even occasionally? We have had a number of claims where volunteers fell from ladders, or even worse, from improvised ladders like a chair. So make sure that ladders or step stools are easily available. If the volunteer is working where you cannot provide the equipment yourself, a ladder or a stool, just have them bring their own. They can leave it in their vehicle until it's needed. Volunteers carrying things. Now, I don't know in your world whether there's a lot of stairways involved, but if there are, one hand should always be free to use the handrail. And don't carry anything heavy enough to require both hands. That is inviting a fall. You just take more trips, that's all. You might be thinking that this is all common sense, and it really is. But I'm telling you that every day we see claims resulting from these kinds of falls. So it's just very important to have the volunteer aware of the environment and how they can avoid these risks and identify and avoid. And you can be surprised maybe how expensive these injuries can be. By the time you add up the ambulance bill, doctor and hospital charges, prescription drugs, physical therapy, you get into several $1,000s quickly. All right, here's another kind of injury that might be present in your world as in the activities that you do. Volunteers moving things, especially heavy things. A volunteer in our program was hauling furniture in a pickup truck once. The truck was full, the load was not balanced, and when he tried to take the first piece out of the truck, the whole thing shifted and knocked him out of the truck. He suffered a broken leg. So think about how you could prevent something like that. You make more trips instead of overloading the truck. or you get a bigger truck, or maybe the volunteer required some training in the use of ropes. In risk management, always look for the simplest, most practical solution, because usually that's the right one. There's no magic in risk management, just some assembly required. Now, when volunteers have to lift things and carry things, what is the big risk there? If you said back injury, you are correct. So make sure volunteers know how to lift properly. You lift with the legs, not with the back. Maybe the loads they are carrying should be smaller. Maybe materials handling equipment such as hand trucks and dollies are needed. Next slide, please, Bethany. We have a number of documents that we've developed over the years that we call our preventer papers. These are very good for safety training, either in small groups or just to give to volunteers individually. Okay, next slide, please. Let's look at some other kinds of injury claims. If your volunteers use tools in their work, have them show you that they know how to use those tools, not just tell you they do. One volunteer was trying to pull a nail from a board for the very first time, and instead of prying it out, she tried to pull it straight out of the board, straight toward her face. And yes, that hammer slipped and hit her in the mouth and caused a lot of expensive dental work. But 1 minute of training by the supervisor could have prevented all that. Have the volunteer show you, hey, we're going to be pulling some nails today. Show me how you do that. And if the volunteer doesn't know, train them. And that's risk management at a very basic level. Also, have your veteran volunteers train the new ones. That reinforces the veteran volunteer's knowledge, as well as passing that knowledge on to the new volunteer. We see claims resulting from injuries when volunteers are working outdoors. Many times those can be prevented by just requiring them to wear the right kind of clothing and shoes, long sleeves, gloves, safety glasses, especially those gloves. Anytime your volunteers are using cutting tools or handling sharp materials, have them wear leather gloves. You don't have to provide them, just tell them to bring their own. Allergic reactions to bee stings, poison ivy, and pollen. We see claims from that. So the protective clothing can help, and maybe a mask, but perhaps the volunteer who has allergies should be assigned something to do indoors, or maybe provide transportation services, at least at certain times of the year. It's okay to ask about allergies and any other medical condition or physical limitation that might affect their ability to carry out a task safely. They'll appreciate the concern, and you can prevent some problems. All right, I'm going to pause right here to take any questions you might have about falls or safe lifting, outdoor work, use of tools. Nothing so far? All right. If you think of something else later, we can get back to it. Take time to watch your volunteers in action and correct them if they're doing something that's unsafe. Just let them know you want everyone to work safely so no one gets hurt. If you say it with an attitude of helpfulness, they will appreciate the message and they will be more aware of hazards. Again, part of developing an attitude or a culture of safety awareness in the organization. All right, next slide, please. Let's move away from accidents and injuries and talk about that L word, liability. Every time I've been to a conference, to do a workshop or a webinar, someone brings up liability and says, we'd really like to do this or that kind of program, but we're not sure what our liability would be. So the good news is liability usually can be managed. You can put that L word in its place. So let's look at what the word really means. Liability is a situation in which the volunteer and/or the organization is held responsible for bodily injury or property damage. If there's a lawsuit, it will say that your volunteer was negligent or your organization was. Now, here's a working definition you might want to write down. This is what negligence means. You did not do something you should have known to do. or you did something you should have known not to do. Didn't do something you should have known to do, or failed to do something, or you did something you should have known not to do. That's what it is. If you did not properly screen, train, and supervise the volunteer who's involved, that is how liability might extend to your organization. We'll talk about training and supervising a little later. Now, the charges might not be valid. People are sued all the time for things they didn't do. But it's important to create an environment where the chances of a liability claim are as low as you can make them. Sometimes claims in our insurance program arise out of situations involving vulnerable people, such as children, the elderly, and those with chronic illness or disabilities. I'm not sure that that is going to be applicable to the work that you do, but anyone can get back to me. My contact information will be there at the end of the presentation. And if you have questions about that kind of risk exposure, I'll be happy to discuss. Now, for anyone, I'll just say this, for anyone who is working with vulnerable clients, any volunteer, it's good risk management to perform a criminal background check. Sterling Volunteers is one good provider of screening services. They are a partner of ours. Now, background checks are good, but they're not enough. You might have a volunteer who's never been arrested or investigated for anything, but still might injure a client. It might be a verbal assault, could be even a physical assault. Sometimes volunteers have lost their temper and actually struck people in their care. So you have to have rules on what volunteers can and cannot do, and communicate and enforce those rules. All right. Now, do your volunteers sometimes in their work, do they deal physically with perhaps victims, injured people who have been suffered an injury as a result of some, let's say, a natural disaster situation? That's going to be beyond the scope of what we're talking about here. So I'm going to stay in my lane and not talk about medical attention to injured parties. But as far as liability in general goes, where a volunteer could be held responsible for injuring someone or damaging someone's property, I'll take any questions, though, if you have them, before we move on to automobile liability, which I think probably is more relevant to your actual activities. Any questions about liability in general?
If anybody has any questions, go ahead and unmute your mic and you can ask.
All right, then let's turn to next slide, Bethany. Let's turn to the automobile risk exposure. I imagine you do have volunteers using their personal vehicles to transport people or maybe just supplies from one place to another. From the claims that we see in our program, accidents at intersections are the most common kind. Left turns when you don't have the right of way, turning from the wrong lane, running stop signs, those kinds of things. Poor visibility and inclement weather is another frequent cause. Now, sometimes accidents are very serious. A volunteer insured in our program turned left in front of an oncoming vehicle. She was killed, and the two occupants of the other vehicle were seriously injured. There have been other very serious accidents that were the volunteer's fault. Getting motor vehicle records is a very good idea to make sure your volunteers have not had serious violations. Just like with background checks, when you get motor vehicle records on your volunteers who drive, that can help if your organization is sued for something the volunteer did. It demonstrates your due diligence, and that protects you against a charge of negligence. If I'm not sure if in your state annual inspection, vehicle inspection is required. Does Illinois require that? Or you might have volunteers in other states. Anyway, In any state where annual inspection is required, put each volunteer's vehicle inspection date on your calendar and ask them for a copy of the certificate each year. Due diligence. Again, vehicle-related accidents don't always occur in traffic. We had a claim resulting from a fatality in a parking lot. The volunteer did not realize that the client was behind the car and backed over her. Now, remember I said that risk management, usually the simplest solution is the best. Can you think about how that could have been prevented? If there had simply been a rule that the volunteer could not leave the parking spot until the client was safely buckled in, the client might be alive today. In another claim, a client tried to get into the volunteer's car while the car was in gear. The volunteer's foot slipped off the brake and the client fell and broke her leg. Now, if the volunteer had been trained to keep her doors locked unless the car was in park, the client would not have been able to open the door and try to get in. So think about risk exposures like that in your world, and consider having a written test on requirements that your volunteers must pass before they can transport anyone for you. Those preventer papers that I mentioned, 24 of them are specifically about vehicle safety. We also have an online vehicle safety training program we developed a few years ago with the National Volunteer Transportation Organization. It is designed specifically for volunteers. The volunteer goes through at their own pace, has information in several different sections, and then they must answer questions about that information before they advance to the next section. Some of our organizations make that mandatory for their drivers. All right, the next slide, please. The last of the four most common risks I want to mention is dishonesty. What access do volunteers, or your staff for that matter, have to bank information and other sensitive data that might present an opportunity for embezzling funds? It happens sometimes. Almost always it's a big surprise. The thief is someone who was trusted. Some of you from Illinois might know of a famous case in the town of Dixon, where a lady was able to embezzle $50 million over a period of several years and fund a very lavish lifestyle. Anyway, we do have some documents in our resources on preventing dishonest acts. All right, questions about the automobile risk exposure, employee dishonesty, or anything else we've covered up to now? Okay, I guess I'm doing an okay job then, or either that or I've just left everyone stunned. So let's go on then and talk about how to put all this together in a system. Next slide. This slide shows the basic steps. We've done risk identification today as we reviewed various injury and liability scenarios. That's the first step. Then what comes next is deciding what risks you should worry about most and which ones you can accept. Then determine how you can reduce or eliminate the most serious risks. Insurance is for the serious risk you cannot eliminate entirely. Next, decide how you will respond if an incident does occur. Make risk management a guiding principle of your selection, orientation, and training. Hold people accountable for following your procedures. And if something bad does happen, learn what you can from it so that it doesn't happen again. All right, let's break this down. After you've thought about the fall hazards, the back injuries, working with vulnerable people, some of the other risks we've identified, dig deeper. Get your best people together and think about what could possibly happen. Your best people might include someone from outside your organization that's already been through the process you're starting. It could be a group of volunteer managers, a DOVIA type group. It could be someone, a discussion group on LinkedIn. Lots of good sources for information. So as you explore that question, what could possibly go wrong? You know, utilities and mass transit systems have been exploring this question for many years. Maybe some of you were involved in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy in 2012. New chapters were added to those disaster plans at that point. The big ice storm that hit Atlanta several years ago, that resulted in some new chapters to the disaster plans. I think one is titled, "It's Not Good for Everyone to Try to Go Home at Once." So think about that question, what could possibly go wrong? And to find answers, you have to dig deep. We talked about screening volunteers and training them to prevent a possible assault on someone in their care, but look at it from the other side too. What if a volunteer were assaulted by someone they're trying to help? You know, that I imagine that could happen if someone's been through a natural disaster and stress is high. What if a volunteer is assaulted by a dog? Would these kinds of scenarios be possible in your world? Do those that your volunteers are helping ever ask the volunteer to do an unexpected task, something that they haven't been trained for? For example, maybe moving a piece of heavy furniture or another heavy object. When that happens, pump the brakes. You want to help people, of course, but you want to make sure that the volunteer supervisor understands the request before the volunteer agrees to do it. Very important to have it go up the chain of command that way. This prevents the volunteer from getting into a situation where he or she might be injured or might be put into a situation where they're falsely accused of doing something. So that's an important part of the supervisor's role, is to understand what the request is, discuss it with the volunteer. If the volunteer is not able to carry it out, perhaps another organization in your area is better equipped to do that. But think about these risk scenarios. What if a volunteer unintentionally violated IRS rules regarding political activity by nonprofits? That could jeopardize your tax exempt status. Or to make statements on behalf of your organization that favor a particular political candidate. Same hazard there. You could lose your tax exempt status. So in brainstorming your scenarios, don't stop until you have at least 25. And then look at each of them and assign a grade of A, B, C, or D for the severity of the risk. The disasters that would threaten your very existence would have a grade of A, and those you could get past with minor inconvenience would be a grade of D. And as you think about these risks, particularly the very serious ones, is there anything that would be too uncomfortable to discuss as you develop your risk management program? Maybe something involving potential criminal activity or elder abuse, whatever it might be. There cannot be any taboos in risk management. If it can't be discussed, it can't be managed. So first, you assess the severity of all the risks. Again, using the A, B, and C and D system, look at the frequency. Now, if your volunteers are working outdoors, and I know that's the primary activity for many of your volunteers, if they're, for example, doing light construction or repair, they might get a finger mashed every now and then. It sort of comes with the territory. So that's a frequency of A, but usually the injury is not severe. So it isn't a risk you should worry about too much. On the other hand, there could be a very remote risk scenario that's so severe you want to reduce or eliminate it as a top priority. So just consider severity and frequency together as you evaluate your risks. Then, once you've identified them, go to the next step here. Next slide. What can you do to eliminate or reduce them? Yeah, and I covered that briefly when I discussed the having the supervisor involved in any sort of request that goes outside of the volunteers' training for what their primary job is. Again, As you think about reducing risk, keep in mind that another volunteer-based organization might be better suited for certain activities. My association does have a lot of resources to help you in this area. In addition to those preventer papers that I mentioned, we have dozens of other documents that we've developed over the years based on the actual claims in our program. You see a reference in the second bullet there to risk transfer. That means you buy insurance for the serious risks you cannot eliminate entirely. That's what our organization specializes in. All right, next slide, please, Bethany. Let's have a look at selection, orientation, and training. I'm sure that you have outstanding programs for that. It's so important in risk management. Make your volunteer application form work to your advantage as you select and assign your volunteers. Use it to describe available assignments and ask about their areas of interest or expertise. Ask about allergies or other medical conditions or limitations that could affect your assignments, including driving. If you have the completed registration form and written job descriptions, it's very easy to match your volunteers and your assignments. The selection process also includes background checks if the volunteer is working with vulnerable clients or handling money. But be careful, the Federal Trade Commission has ruled that the Fair Credit Reporting Act applies to volunteers just as much as employees. So if you pull a credit history on a volunteer, you have to have a reason to do it that's related to their responsibilities. You can't just do it for all volunteers, regardless of what they do. That's why it's best to leave it to a professional such as Sterling Volunteers. Orientation is so important. One of the risks with volunteer involvement is not communicating what's expected, and your orientation program is a good opportunity to reduce that risk. When people are left to improvise, the results just might not be very good. So take that off the table. Does the volunteer know who to report to? Who do they see if they need something or have a complaint or a problem? Take time to explain your safety rules that go with the volunteer assignment, record keeping requirements, and so forth. Taking time to do it right makes a positive impression on the kind of volunteer that you always want to attract. And again, as I mentioned earlier, have your veteran volunteers involved in the training of the new ones. Next slide. Accountability. Correct poor performance and discipline volunteers as needed. Just because they're unpaid, that doesn't mean you can't discipline them and even terminate them if necessary. In a close-knit organization, people can be reluctant to question or criticize others, but that creates a risk. Don't worry about offending the volunteer. As long as you're sincere with them and keep your organization's interests as your first priority, you'll be okay. Also, if you adopt new performance standards, make sure that your current volunteers know that the new standards are not some backdoor criticism of them. Let them know you're adopting some standard procedures as part of your program to manage risks. With volunteer risk management, so much depends on good communication. Now, to the last item here, next slide. If something bad happens despite your best efforts, what do you do? Have formal procedures for responding to an incident. If a volunteer is injured, injures someone else, or damages someone's property, what are their responsibilities? What are the supervisor's responsibilities? Make sure it's written, communicated, and understood. That chain of command is so important. Make sure volunteers know if there's an injury or a potential liability situation, they are to report it to their supervisor, not to the police, not to the local government agency, but to the supervisor, as long as that complies with the mandated reporting laws of your jurisdiction. Make it the supervisor's job to handle it from there, not the volunteer's job. That way you keep the chain of command intact. And what the supervisor should do goes back to those brainstorming of risk scenarios we talked about. The appropriate response needs to be developed for each risk. In the case of an injury, once the injured person gets medical attention, Get as much information as you can about what caused the injury. Talk to witnesses, write down what they say, get their contact information. If there's a dispute over the facts, get both sides of the story. If you have a situation where a liability claim might arise, that is, someone might claim later that they were injured or their property was damaged, don't admit liability, just get the facts and tell the other party that you will report the incident to your insurance company. Now, you need to report it right away because claims often are slow to develop, particularly liability claims. Many times, those claims can be traced back to one or two incidents that happened months earlier. So it's important to begin your investigation at the first hint of a problem and also put your insurance company on notice. Don't let your attorney decide whether to report the claim, and don't wait for it to blow over. That could jeopardize your coverage. The insurance contract, if you read the fine print, says you must provide what they call timely notification. And you don't want to be in a position of arguing about whether your claim was timely. And then, after your initial response to the incident, see what you can learn from it. What are the lessons learned? Deconstruct what happened. Were your safety procedures being followed? If not, why not? What should have been done differently? And having that information can help with training to prevent a future occurrence. Always use your experience to refine your processes. All right, at this point, that concludes what I have to share with you. I'll be happy to answer any questions that might have come up during the presentation.
Hi, William. It's Jeanette. Before I get to the questions in the chat, I do want to just say a caveat that you are not legal counsel for any of the local units. You are not legal counsel for Illinois. We are tapping into your expertise in volunteer insurance. So with that caveat, there was a question about whether or not a waiver is sufficient to cover an organization. In your experience, what would you say to that question?
Well, the record is intact. I don't believe I've ever given a presentation where this question did not come up. And it's understandable. And many organizations do require a waiver as part of their process. It's okay, but the best purpose of a waiver is simply to focus a volunteer's attention on the fact that hazards do exist. Many times, a judge has looked at a waiver and said, I'm striking this down. I'm letting this lawsuit go forward because the waiver is construed too much in favor of the organization. So I'm telling you that just to say, don't rely on it for a shield.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay to have it, but just don't rely on it for total protection.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a fair answer. Another question came up. I'm not sure if you're able to answer this. How does the Local Government Disaster Services Volunteer Act help us as a local government agency?
Can you describe that for me? Because I'm not familiar with that particular act.
Michael,
What does it?
Yeah, Michael Frakes asked this question.
Yeah, I don't know if we can get a description of it real quick, because if not, I do have sort of an answer.
Okay, I can send you some of the direct sections and references from the act itself. It talks about what a local agency is, and it's as a definition that talks about the disasters as a definition, and it tries to provide. Let's see here. Hold on. This act applies to all counties, municipalities, townships, and home rule units that by ordinance adopt provisions of this act. It's really protecting, looks like it's protecting the volunteers more than anything else. What I can do is just try to copy some of this and attach it.
Yeah, Bethany, go ahead and put the next slide on. I believe that's my contact information. Michael, this is if the idea is to provide immunity if the idea is to provide immunity to volunteers, I'll just give you, and I haven't seen this act, but this is true of the federal act and every state act that I've ever seen. There are usually a couple of gaping holes. Gross negligence is exempted. And if I'm a plaintiff's attorney, I'm going to really go to town with this gross negligence exemption and claim that that's what happened. Also, every one of the acts that I'm familiar with excludes any activity involving a motor vehicle. So those are the two gaping holes that I have seen in every other immunity law.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Bill. I appreciate that. We're kind of getting into this via the Red Cross. We're trying to have a stronger collaboration between the two of us, and the Red Cross is the one who directed us to this this act and provided us with some of the specific sections from it that it's most applicable to us. But no, I will say you're absolutely correct. Most these acts are not something that will provide a complete waiver for any act whatsoever. I mean, like you said, gross negligence, it doesn't really, or criminal activity, it doesn't really protect from stuff like that. And it's usually, I think, vague enough that most plaintiffs can attack it. It just depends on how
Correct.
well you defend it.
Right. Do you have a memo of understanding between your organization and the Red Cross?
Not yet. That's what that's the next step, and they're working on that now. We're scheduled to meet with them in two months, roughly.
Mm-hmm. Is there, do you have access to legal counsel who could review that for you?
We will between now, well, we will once we get the MOU from the Red Cross.
Right. Yeah.
We won't blindly sign it, especially with them. I mean, they're fully reputable, of course, but we're not going to blindly, just
Right.
sign
Sure.
it outright.
I would just defer to your counsel on that.
Right.
It sounds like it could be very useful, though.
Well, yeah, I think it can, and I think what we're trying to do is this part of our outreach is try to understand all that we can possibly understand, and the Red Cross, I think, is may be one of our closest mentors, if you will, when it gets into larger volunteers and response or recovery. So but it was just something that I thought of as you were giving your presentation, which I think is very good, and it has a lot of really common sense stuff in it, as you said. So,
and by the
appreciate
way,
your time with it. Thank you.
By the way, Bethany, I believe I provided you some handouts to pass along to the attendees. One of them is a summary of the fundamentals of a volunteer risk management program, which is a little bit more detailed version of what I gave you today, and some of it might not be applicable to your particular work, but I hope it will at least give you some guideposts.
Yes, after today's webinar, the recording of the presentation and the handouts will be posted on the website for all the coordinators.
Okay. Can you put that last slide up that has my contact information?
I shared the contact information in the chat. For some reason, PowerPoint shut down on me. I'll go ahead and try and share it here again.
While Bethany is doing that, William, we have one more question from Marcia.
Okay.
Regarding automobile liability, does that begin and end when the volunteer leaves and returns home, or when they arrive and leave the site of service?
In our insurance program that provides excess liability coverage for volunteer drivers. The coverage applies during the actual assignment. So if the volunteer leaves home and goes to wherever the assignment begins, that an accident would not be covered. And after they leave their assignment and go back home, it would not be covered. But the actual travel to accomplish that assignment would be covered. And it applies in addition to the volunteer's personal auto liability coverage. It provides additional limits.
And just
that
to clarify,
information is all on our website.
What I think you're saying, William, is if I'm going to a clinic to work, I'm not covered in that space. However, if the manager at the clinic is asking me to go pick up supplies in that activity that I've been assigned to, I would be covered.
Yes, or to
Okay.
transport someone who needs to get from point A to point B, that would be covered.
Wonderful. Thank you. Marcia, let us know if that did not answer your question. I think that's all I see in the chat room. Yep. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. I'll turn it over to you, Bethany.
Okay, so William, thank you so much for sharing with us today, for presenting. I think this is a very, very good presentation for the local leaders. One of the things that after this presentation that I wanted to make sure and share with everyone. So last MRC Strong grant year, there was funding for volunteer protections. There is still funding for volunteer protections this year that is available for the units to apply for. This is reimbursement funds for $600 per unit until the funds are expended. The reimbursement forms are available on the website under the MRC Strong tab, where the application for the subaward is, that information is on there as well. So the reimbursement is for, like I said, up to $600. And if you have any questions in regards to that, please feel free to reach out at any time. But then that way you can help to use that to fund any for volunteer protections for your unit. So again, I encourage you guys to go on there and take a look at it. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out at any time. Are there any last minute questions for William or in regards to the presentation today? Tiffany.
Yes, sorry, one more question. When you get coverage, is it for a specific volunteer or is it for our unit for any sort of activity?
It is for all of your volunteers. When you apply, you would just indicate how many volunteers you need to cover, and the cost is computed automatically on the application for you. So you have that cost information before you decide whether or not to purchase the coverage.
Thanks.
There's a minimum premium on each of our policies of $100. So if you only had 5 volunteers that you wanted to cover for accident insurance, for example, at $4.40 each, it would still be $100. That's the minimum premium.
Okay. Awesome. So if anybody else has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. William's contact information is in the chat, as well as the on the presentation that'll be posted online. That said, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here.
Well, before you do that, let me just say